though it's only some in life. We sing about memories, stories that we share. We'll fall deeper in love as we stop and just stare. My eyes only on you, they sparkle with love, don't forget my charm too. There will never be another, live this life only for you. I give you this promise that I will hold true.
If you were living with the Lord, then who you with?
Who you with?
If you were living with the Lord, then who you with?
Who you with? Hey.
You are hungry, together with the Lord every day, all day. You are hungry, together with the Lord all day, all day. You are hungry, together with the Lord every day, all day. You are hungry, together with the Lord all day, all day.
We believe in the same God, but we are on different levels.
When I look at you, it's like I got the whole room on the tip of my finger, and I'm pointing it right back to you. When I look at you, it's like I got the whole universe, the whole universe. Never thought that living could be easy. So you taught me right from wrong, now I'm free to be full of love, full of hope, I'm empty of all things. I'm living to make everyone come follow me. This is a life worth living that I know. If I love someone else, what would he give me though? It's like I'm floating on clouds, my feet don't touch the ground. Life with you is like heaven, look at what I found. You said believe in me, don't change and then you'll see a life that lasts for all eternity. And I will never live to have any regrets. I know you're the best, I'll step to the west, I'll follow behind you step by step. Just like the stars above, we shining, shining. Look at the world, in my hands and the universe is mine. It's yours, can't escape from the love, it's yours. It's yours, can't escape from the love, it's yours. Just like the stars above, we shining, shining. Look at the world, in my hands and the universe is mine. It's yours, can't escape from the love, it's yours. It's yours, can't escape from the love, it's yours. When I look at you, it's like I got the whole room on the tip of my finger, and I'm pointing it right back to you. When I look at you, it's like I got the whole universe, the whole universe. You said believe in me, don't change and then you'll see a life that lasts for all eternity. And I will never live to have any regrets. I know you're the best, I'll step to the west, I'll follow behind you step by step. Just like the stars above, we shining, shining. Look at the world, in my hands the universe is mine. It's yours, can't escape from the love, it's yours. It's yours, can't escape from the love, it's yours. Just like the stars above, we shining, shining. Look at the world, in my hands the universe is mine. It's yours, can't escape from the love, it's yours. It's yours, can't escape from the love, it's yours. When I look at you, it's like I got the whole room on the tip of my finger, and I'm pointing it right back to you. When I look at you, it's like I got the whole universe, 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 the whole universe.
If this love breaks, then everything shatters. But I won't get it to that point, so it doesn't matter. I pray my love will never fail and my ashes make you smile. You're the reason why I'm singing all about you. This waterfall, love is pouring out. It keeps flowing, never running out. Hey, turn on the nitrous to ignite this. Let me write this love on a letter. I let them know this love got me pushing my weight up. I got it impressed, so I'll stay up. The drip is impressive, I'm way up. My love is unchanging, I'm next up. My love is like a waterfall in Sanders. My love is like a waterfall in Sanders. Oh, you are one, it's you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lockdown Tuesday. I hope you guys had a wonderful week. This is Sky, and I hope that you guys will enjoy today's lesson of going against the grain. So today is sponsored by a good iced latte, which I already drank half of already, from Garage 51, which is decent. It's pretty good. I don't know what drink you guys have, but you guys can put in the chat room what kind of drinks you guys have. I'm sure you guys have either like a bubble tea, a coffee. Some of you might even have some water. So we're going to start today's Bible story, and like I said, we're going to talk about the story of Abraham. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the actual title itself. So people are asking me, because, you know, in America, this is a very famous saying of going against the grain. Okay? And what it is, like, say if you have wood, there's a grain where there's lines like this. You know, I got a better one. You know durian? Durian's got lines on it. And if you cut against it, it's really hard to open. But if you cut along the lines, what happens is you can easily pull it apart. If you cut against the lines, what happens is it's more difficult. In life, when you say you're going against the grain, it means it's an action or an idea that is difficult to accept or do because it conflicts with your beliefs, your ideas, and also your principles. So what people do is they kind of follow what everyone else is doing, right? Whether it's an action or the way people think, everyone is going along the grain. But every once in a while, what happens is there are people that come against it, and of course, everyone goes nuts. So let me tell you a very interesting thing that you should think about. If you do just like everyone else does, then what's going to happen? You will have the exact same result as everyone else, which is normal and average. Now, if you look at the super successful people in the world, they don't do what the average person does. They don't go with the grain, but they go against it, and the result is completely different, and it's so much higher. Let me give you an example. In the furniture industry, you know, you could buy furniture in tons of places, right? So you go to a furniture shop, and in the past, back in my days, right? What happens was you buy furniture, and then after you buy it, you rent a huge truck, put all this furniture into the truck, and you take it to your house, and then you put it in your house. Whether it's like huge couches or tables, everything is just there, put in the truck, and it's gone. That's going with the grain. But then someone came along and went against the grain. And you know who it was? It was the people from Sweden, or was it Finland? I think it's Sweden, and it was IKEA. And what did IKEA do? They said, no, let them make it themselves. And people are like, no one's going to want to make it themselves. They're like, no. We're going to make furniture. They're going to make it themselves. And what happens is, now people bring regular cars, minivans, small trucks, and they can load all the furniture they want, and all they do is they assemble it at home. That is going against the grain, and now they are very successful. Another one is a company that all of you know right now really, really well. You know who it is? Netflix. Okay, everyone knows Netflix right now, right? I'm sure you're watching like The Last Dance with Michael Jordan, or that Korean drama of zombies with the king, whatever it is, right? There's so many things on there. Not that I watch it, maybe, possibly, but not sure, but maybe. Okay, either way. So Netflix, you know what was here before Netflix? It's a place called Blockbuster Video. I don't know if any of you remember this. You actually had to drive to the store and you rented VHS cassettes or DVDs. And then you pay for them, and you get it for one night, and the next day you have to bring it back to the store. Netflix is all on the internet. Where's Blockbuster? Doesn't exist. Why? They started online streaming services for renting videos, which is now everywhere in the world. And now that we're in lockdown, I think that everyone is living off of Netflix. It's like in your blood or something, right? So that's what it means to go against the grain. So the story we're going to talk about today is one of the most successful people in the Bible, and this figure is Abraham. How big is Abraham? He is considered the father of all faith in Judaism and Christianity, everything goes back to Abraham. And even Jesus kind of mentions him as the beginning of faith. He is the father of faith. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn from his life of going against the grain. Okay? So let's go into the first thing that happened to him in his life, and we call it the calling. Okay? This is the calling. And we'll find this in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. And this is the first thing that God told Abraham. This is crazy. You got to think about this, okay? It says, the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." The very first thing God told him was, leave the most comfortable place. He was living in Mesopotamia, which is one of like the most known ancient civilizations that you know, it's like Egypt and Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia was even there before Abraham, like 2,000 years before him. So if you think about this, that place is developed for that time. Lots of entertainment, lots of trade, comfortable. You know, it's a place where his father used to live, which means they are settled there. And honestly, if you were settled somewhere, would you want to move? And you know what, God was not telling him just to move like to the next door. He's saying, go to another country. And you know what's even crazier? The other country's not even made yet. So he has to leave this established, comfortable place and by faith go over to somewhere else and do what? And build another place. Now, what am I going to ask you is this. God was asking him to do what? To go to uncomfort and to go to suffering. That's what he's telling. Now, how many of you would do that? If right now, some of you have kids, some of you have dogs, cats, whatever it is, take all your possessions, everything you have, and God say, hey, you know what? Go to Singapore. Actually, Singapore's pretty nice, so let's try somewhere else. Where's a place that is not as good as Malaysia? And I know that there's some people from other countries watching, so I don't want to make any mistakes. Let's just say I'll make fun of my own country. Let's just say God says, I want you to go to Canada. And let's pretend it's worse. We'll just pretend for now, okay? So if you said to go to Canada, how many of you would, like, even if it was God saying to you, move, go, get out of here, how many of you would be like, yes, let me go? You'd be like, what? But God, I got everything here, and my family's here, my friends are here, I got a job here. No. And even if it was a little bit uncomfortable here, even if you didn't have the job that you liked, you would probably kind of resist and say, I don't know if I can do this. You see, everyone doesn't like risk. We don't. We don't like going to a place that's uncomfortable. We don't like going to a place where we have to suffer or start over or leave the people that we're connected to, we feel comfortable with. We don't like starting over. We don't like rebuilding, especially when you're already settled. And if you take a look at Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7 and 8, this was the calling. And you know what? All of us have this in our life at one time or another. It says, the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear this voice, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. All of us in our lives, you'll get that voice saying, you know what? Leave this job. Or leave this person. Or leave your friends. Or leave your school. Or it's something, everyone has that calling in their hearts. For some of us, we call it God. Some of us think it's just our own conscience. But everyone has that calling. And one of the hardest things to do is to restart. But the difference is, the thing I'm telling you right now is, the thing that made Abraham successful, the thing that made him even greater than what he was, is he was willing to restart. And he's willing to push himself out of his comfort zone. And one thing we have to realize too is, especially in this time of lockdown, I'm sure many of you are bored. Many of you have seen every episode on Netflix. But many of you also are starting to think very deeply about your life and reflecting on what's going to happen. Why? Some of you are going to need to change your jobs. Some of you are going to rethink about the people you're living with. Some of you are going to even rethink about your boyfriends and girlfriends. Some of you may even rethink about your husbands and wives. Like, God forbid that, right? But it's true. In our hearts, we all have callings. Whether it's to move to another place, the next region, the next country. But the one thing we can learn from Abraham is, if you always go with the grain, you will always miss out the greater opportunity. And we have to be those people that learn from Abraham. What is the wisdom? Yeah, sometimes we have to listen to the calling that we have in our heart so we can go to the next stage in life. You know what the sad thing about people is? The sad thing is we would rather stay comfortable for that moment and suffer in the long run than suffer a little bit in the beginning and have something greater in the future. Let's go to the second point. The second point is called bargaining with God. This is very interesting, or confronting God. Now we're going to take a look at Genesis chapter 18, verse 32. And this is a very interesting situation because Abraham meets up with God, or someone who is the representative of God, right? There's three of them. And, you know, he feeds them, he takes care of them, then they're walking away. And all of a sudden, look at Genesis chapter 18, 32, it says, may the Lord not be, sorry, not this one. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. Well, basically what he says, God says to him is, you know what? Could I keep this away from Abraham? This news that I have for him? And what's the news? The news is, I'm going to be judging Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Abraham's like, and you know, you got to think about this. He's talking to God, and he's like this. Hey, God, what if there's like 50 like righteous people? Would you still like destroy the area? Like, I should know he doesn't talk like that, but let's just pretend he does, right? And God's like, no, for 50 people, wouldn't do it. And he's like, 45? And God's like, no, 45, I wouldn't destroy it. And he's like, forgive me for being so bold. How about 40? And God's like, no, not for 40. 30? And he starts bargaining with God. Like, you got to think about this. Tell me how crazy this is. To bargain with God, and not just once, he does it 5 times until the number comes down to 10 people, right? And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 18, verse 32. It's that last one. He's like, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there? And what does God say? For the sake of 10, I'm not going to destroy it. So here's the thing. Am I telling you to go to your bosses and mouth them off and say, oh, you know, be bold and talk to your bosses and tell them, hey, boss, you suck, or whatever it is? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying that is we need to know our relationships. We might think to ourselves that Abraham is super bold. Like, oh my gosh, how did he do that with God? The only reason we would say that is because we don't have that relationship with God. That's the only reason. That's why some people are scared to talk to their bosses and some aren't. You have to know your relationship. I'm not telling you to go to your parents and mouth them off. I'm not telling you to stand up against your bosses. I'm not saying any of these things. What I'm saying is you need to know your relationships that you have. You see, Abraham had a relationship of respect with God. He already knew the relationship. It was a clear understanding of the relationship the two of them had. He obviously respected God, and he knew that God respected him also. Let's look at Luke chapter 12, verse 7. How much does God respect people? And you have to know this too, because we should be bold enough too, and it wouldn't even be bold if we understood how God saw us too. It says, the very hairs on your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows. God is like, come on. Do you really think you're nothing? You're created in my image. Abraham had a clear understanding of the relationship he had with God. And this is why he's not sitting there mouthing God off. But because the relationship is understood, this is why he was able to speak up to God. Now, when we look at our lives too, I want you to take a look at your life also with the close and important relationships that you have. Can you speak your mind? Do you feel respected? Do you feel you can say what you need to say? Even if situation like someone has made up their mind, are you comfortable enough to say something and try to change their mind? Are you in those types of relationships? Or do you find yourself stuck? Where they say something, you're like, I can't say anything. Oh, can I really say something? Oh, no, I don't know if I can say anything about this. One of the biggest issues we have is I'm not bringing this up so you stand up to people above you. No. The only reason I brought this up is because in our hearts, in our perspective, we think, wow, how could he stand up to God? And the answer is, he can stand up to God not because he can. It's because it's only in our perspective that we think he's standing up. But if you know the relationship and there's a clear understanding, then what happens? then it is not standing up to God. It's a normal relationship that both sides understand. You see, you need to search for this in your everyday life too, and in the important and major relationships that you have, right? If you want your relationships to last, you have to have a clear understanding of each other and a clear understanding of respect, which means what? You can't enable people to keep trampling on you or shutting you down. That's not a proper relationship for your major close relationships. Even Abraham clearly understood his relationship with God, and could ask 5 times, hey God, come on, how about 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? And for us, it seems a little bit much. But if you really understood the relationship and the love they had for each other, then it's not that big, right? Sometimes we'll look at that and we'll say, oh, maybe, I'm not allowing, these people are really rude or they're not very good people. But actually, sometimes it's just that you're not ready. Sometimes it's just you. Which means that, you not being ready is like, sometimes we get into relationships and people walk all over us or people don't respect us. But what do? You kind of just go with the flow. You know what I mean? Just because you don't want to. This is one of the biggest issues that we have today is people don't like getting into confrontations. And that's why this section is called Confronting God. Confronting, you got to be able to come in front of these people. Doesn't mean to fight, but it means to be respected and to respect each other. And I hope that you guys too will learn from this situation that even Abraham, having a clear understanding of the relationship, could even talk to God, which is quite amazing. All right? So let's go to the next one. The third point is, we call this, and this is really famous, we call this the greatest test. Right? The greatest test. And this story is quite amazing because Abraham had a kid at 100 years old, like his only son. Back then, the sons were like everything. We'll talk about this a little bit later. But Abraham had his only son, and you know what God tells him to do? Look at Genesis chapter 22, verse 2. And this is what God tells Abraham to do. And this is something like, whoa, like how, what? And he says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. And we're like, what? God is telling Abraham to kill and sacrifice his own son. Okay, so, Abraham takes his son up, ties him up, puts him, they go to the top of the mountain, puts him on an altar, right? And, can you imagine if you were Isaac, his son? Like, what would you be doing? Wouldn't you be like, hey, Dad, why are you tying me up? Hey, Dad, oh, why are you covering my mouth? Hey, Dad, why is there an apple in my mouth? And it's like, you'd be sitting there going, what's going on? And then he puts you on the altar. And can you imagine when you finally figure out, my dad's going to kill me? Like, my dad's going to sacrifice me. So what happens is in the story, I got to get a nice knife here. Takes a knife. And he raises it. And he's like, God, this is for you. Right? It's like, ah, la, 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 whatever it is. And he goes, ah, and he starts to... And right at that point, it's in Genesis chapter 22, verse 12. What does God say? He says, do not lay a hand on the boy. And this is kind of weird, right? Because then it's like, I thought you just told me, what do you mean? Are you a little bit crazy? He's like, kill him. Oh, no, wait, don't kill him. He's like, okay, like, what do you mean? But he says, don't put a hand on the boy. God said, do not do anything to him now that I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So this is an interesting story because he tells Abraham to sacrifice the most valuable thing to him. Abraham was willing to do it, and this is when God considered him the person of faith, that he had so much faith in God that he was even willing to sacrifice his son. So here's the thing. People find this story disturbing. How could God make someone sacrifice their own son? Is this God even good? Like what? How can God do this? Like this loving God makes someone sacrifice their own son. What can we learn from this? And I want to talk to you about what is the main thing we need to learn from this is you need to always see the bigger picture. You're like, what? There's something bigger than your own son? Like that's your own flesh and blood. Is there anything bigger than your own son? Seeing the bigger picture is seeing the great purpose. And what I'm going to tell you today is a lot of the things that you hold so close to you, like your only son, they're not as big as you think. They're not. And you think to yourself, well, what's bigger than my only son? What is my son? Is there anything bigger than my son? And the answer is, yes, there is. And you would agree with me after I tell you these situations, that there are things bigger than your only son. There are. For instance, let me give you an example. There's this video I saw on YouTube, very moving story. And what happens is there's this father that runs a train track, okay, and it's a bridge. So what happens is he switches when the bridge goes up, he has to turn the crank, and then it goes up, and then it comes back down, and he has to put the track back on. So what happens is he tells his friend like, hey, it's his son. He goes to his son, he says, oh, son, something's stuck. Something's stuck over there. So the son goes in, because he's helped his dad a lot, goes down into the box where he's going to fix it. And then all of a sudden, a train is coming. Okay, now train is a passenger train filled with hundreds of people. Then he's like, son, quickly, quickly. The son's about to get out, and the train's getting really close, but then the foot gets stuck. So now, there's only one thing you can do. You either save the son and hundreds of people die, or you crank the track back on and allow your son to die. Question: what do you think is more important at that time? And think honestly. What's more important? And at that moment, and if they sacrificed their only son, would you look at the father and say this? Oh, you're a terrible father. You sacrificed your son so 800 people could live. How many people would actually look at that and say he's a bad father? No, we would actually glorify him. We would say, wow, amazing father that sacrificed his only son so that 800 people could live. True or untrue? Right? It's true. And that's why when you look at certain things, you can't say that the thing that you treasure the most right now, whether it be a person, whether it be your job, whether it be your house, whether it be a car, any of those things, you couldn't really say there's nothing bigger than that. Why? Because there's always something bigger than it. There's always something bigger. Always. Not everything in life is as big as you think. Right? Not everything is. So what do we have to do? The biggest problem that always gets to us is we forget the whole reason why we're doing things. Look at Philippians chapter 3, verse 14. And in Philippians chapter 3, verse 14, it says this. It says, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus, right? I press on toward the goal to win the prize. I mean, your eyes are always on the bigger thing. What's the bigger goal? What is the bigger goal? You see, a lot of times people will forego the big goal for something that's smaller because they forgot about the big goal. Let me give an example that happens all the time in marriages or in relationships. Like when two people get married, the whole point of the marriage is love. Like because you love each other, that's why you're together, that's why you make a family, that's why you have a house, right? So let's say there's married people, right? And the whole reason is because they love each other. That's why they're married. That's why they're together, okay? So we got that in our mind now, right? So here's the thing. Imagine both of them sit together and they say, you know what? Let's have a kid. Because they don't have any kids yet. So let's have a kid. But what's the one condition? The one condition is we don't have enough money, so let's save up some money to get a house. And when we get a house with an extra room just for our baby, then we'll get the baby. Then we'll have a baby. So what both of them do is they both realize is, okay, it's time for us to make money so we can get the baby. So both of them take extra shifts, work overtime, saving more and more money. So what eventually happens? Both of them take overtime, they work more even on weekends, and they stop seeing each other that much because they're at work all the time. And because they're so stressed and they're working so much, saving all this money, they become frustrated and they get angry at each other, and eventually it's too much for them to bear, they both get divorced. What's the problem? Their eyes were only kept on saving money. That's it. They lost the whole point. The big picture was the love between the two of them. But instead, they want a baby, and they think, oh, we got to get a baby. But let's get a baby. We need more money, so we want more money. We got to work more. And they worked like crazy until their relationship broke. What happened? Their eyes were not fixed upon the prize that was there. What am I saying? Is don't forget why you're doing it. There's always a bigger reason. There's always a bigger reason, right? Marriage, relationships, friends, family, work, school. There's always a bigger picture. And if you lose that bigger picture, you get overstressed, frustrated. People get depressed, anxiety. People commit suicide. Why? They lost the bigger picture in the long run. So you can't forget that. So when we look at this story of Abraham, one of the most successful figures in the Bible, what do we see? I'm only talking about 3 things that happened in Abraham's life. And you know what? There's like 6 more. And I had to choose between them. There's just amazing stories inside of it. But I chose 3 that a lot of us can learn from right now at this time. Why am I doing this? Because like I said before, school, classes, academics, they don't teach you how to live life. It's just knowledge. The reason why I'm bringing up Bible stories, I'm showing you that it's fun. I'm showing you that it's not boring, but I'm also showing you that it's relevant right now. It is relevant, and we can all learn from it, whether you believe in God or not. So I hope that you guys, too, received a lot of wisdom today. Grab a sip of your coffee or bubble tea, and we're going to end it here and then move on to our question and answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave about 10 seconds. I'm going to give 10 seconds, just everyone to start writing your questions down. Oh, wow, already questions. Wow. Let's take a look at some questions. Here we go. Take a look at some questions here. Okay, a couple questions here. You keep writing your questions down because as I answer, we're going to answer as many as we can. The first one is from Jin Young in Korea. Jin Young in Korea. And the question is, how do I get a relationship of respect with my boss? This is an interesting question because we talked about the second point is confronting God. But the key point was what? Is clearly understanding the relationship. Okay? Now, it really depends on how important or how major this relationship is to you with your boss. Because sometimes it's not worth it to set parameters and boundaries. Why? Because sometimes people are not that good. The first relationships that you really, really have to start gaining or like making the respect boundaries is with the people closest to you, like family and friends. Those are the most important. They're most important. And then from after that, if you can make one with your boss, it's great too. However, one of the things if it's worth the risk for you, because there's some bosses that are really terrible, but if it's worth it for you to pick this fight, if it's worth it, then you don't want to enable anyone. Enabling someone means that someone puts you down and you allow it to happen, which means you enable them to do it more. So if someone makes fun of me and really puts me down in front of everyone, and I just sit there like this and don't do anything, I'm enabling them to continue to do it. You know what I mean? Which means that you should, if it was me, I would speak up, but not in front of everyone. But I would go privately to my boss and say, hey boss, hey, the joke you made was pretty funny at my expense, but it was a little bit hurtful. And I would like it in the future if you didn't like pick on me this much, you know. And then you would respectfully speak to him. Why? Even though Abraham had a clear understanding of his relationship with God, he still knew who God was. So whenever he talked to God, he's like, God, please don't be upset. Please don't be angry. But can I ask one more? It's like, what if it's 10? Which means he clearly understood the relationship and that God is in a higher position. Which means that don't expect to have a same relationship with your boss, because it's not the same relationship. He is, in a hierarchy, he is above you. So you need to understand the relationship from that perspective. And sometimes it's worth it, and sometimes it's not. All right? Thank you, Jin Young from Korea. Let's look at next question. Let's take a look at John in Kuala Lumpur. Oh, no, Tim. It's good, Tim. Tim in New Zealand says, you talked about Abraham sacrificing his son for something bigger. How do I know what to sacrifice? Okay, so that's a great question because you might be thinking to yourself is, how do I know something's bigger than what I have right now? Now, some things are very obvious. Like I told you, if there's like a million, like, you know, either your son dies or a million people die, and that becomes a little bit more obvious. Even though it hurts a lot, it's a little bit more obvious. But there are some things that are not as obvious, right? And this is why what I suggest to a lot of people is you should write down priorities. Like priorities. Yeah. You have to constantly remind yourself what is more important than the other. And that's something I do suggest as advice for the things that are like very clear, obviously. Like for instance, it is your wife over everyone else. Obviously. Your husband over everyone else. Your children over everyone else. Even your own parents, obviously, right? But after that, it gets a little bit more blurred. Okay? So I want you should write down your priorities too of what is more important to you. Okay? Let's go to John in Kuala Lumpur. Great question here too. Is there a link between God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son and God sacrificing his only son, Jesus? And of course there's a link. And the big link there is both of them were for like a large group of people. For Abraham, he was sacrificing, he was basically showing God his faith. Because when you're starting something, you have to start properly, and faith was the most important part. But if you have someone who doesn't really have absolute faith in God, and they're not even willing to give away the most precious thing, then how could God use that person? If they're not even willing to give up what's most sacred to them, when God should be more sacred, right? The same way too, both histories, right? Both at the time of Jesus, he sacrificed for the world, and Abraham too was basically sacrificing for Israel, which would turn into, like at that time was the world. In the Old Testament time, it was the chosen people. So there is a direct link. And the one thing I find very like awesome about this story is God wouldn't tell people to do what he wouldn't do himself. And he actually did it. He actually sacrificed his only son. So it's not like he was asking people to do something just out of whim, like, you know what? Let's just see how faithful he is. Let's make him sacrifice his son. No. Even God is willing to do it himself. He would never ask people to do something that he wouldn't do himself. Okay, let's go to the next one. We're going to Hong in Johor. Hong in Johor says, I know God has a bigger picture for me, but how do I gain the faith to really believe and entrust myself to him? Great question. Now, what did Abraham do that made it so easy for him to believe? It's actually faith. That's the thing that he did more than anything else. The faith was the biggest thing, which means that I'm assuming you're someone of faith, which means if you really believe that God is great, God knows all things, God is almighty and all-powerful, and like you said, he has a bigger picture for you, then your faith is seen by what you do and not just by what you believe. Right? So when I tell a lot of people this, is like, if you have two cliffs like this and there's an invisible bridge, let's say there's an invisible bridge. If you really believed, if you really had faith there's an invisible bridge, what would you actually do? And the answer is, you would actually cross it. That's why in James chapter 2, verse 26 is like, faith without deeds is dead. Right? Faith without deeds. Right? You have to be someone, when it comes to true faith, you may not know what's going to happen. You may not know what, if something's going to happen in the right way. Like, you don't know what the actual result is going to be, but you need to have faith that because God has a bigger, he's got something bigger in mind for you, that he's leading you the right way. And it requires you to have faith, right? So for us, when let me tell you something interesting about faith too is, whether you believe in God or not, faith is one of the most essential things in this world. Why do you need faith? You need faith because you don't have full information, right? Well, let me ask you this question. How much faith do you have? Like, how much do you know 100% what your major is going to be in university? How much do you know 100% what your job's going to be after that? How much do you know 100% the person you're going to marry? Honestly, it takes faith in everything because you're not 100%. You're never 100% in anything in this world. Faith is required for everything in life. And that's why when you kind of say, hey, God, show me God, prove to me 100% God is there, and then I'll believe, you can't say that. Why? Because almost everything that's in your life begins with faith because you don't have full information. And that's why things start with you having faith, not knowing for sure what's going to be at the end, but trusting that God is going to lead you to a better place. So you got to do first. As crazy as that sounds, you got to do first. Okay, let's go to last question. So last question from Joanna in PJ. This is also in PJ's in Malaysia too. And the question is there a difference between having faith and being obedient to God? And the answer is, they're kind of connected to each other, right? They're kind of connected to each other. Why? Because having faith, if you have faith, you will be obedient. If you have faith, you will be obedient. So they are interconnected. Because you can't be obedient unless you have faith in this person. Of course, unless it's, well, in these days, you don't have any like masters who are beating you if you're a slave or whatever not, right? But you have to realize that in these days, you go in, it's a transactional, two people are willing to, one is willing to hire, one is willing to work. And because you have some trust in this boss, you're going to be obedient to them. Same thing with God, right? Everything we have to understand is when it comes to obedience, you have to have faith in them first to be obedient. Because if you have if you have a really crappy government, like say something happening in countries like say communist countries, then there's no trust. So when they tell you to do something, they're not very obedient. And they'll be obedient for a bit, but you need faith before obedience comes in, right? Unless you're getting beaten to death, right? Or they're threatening you with your like killing your family or whatever it is. But there's none of these cases really right now. So yeah, you need faith before having obedience. Okay. We have one more question. Perfect. One more question. This is the last question today from Yanlan Lo. And this is from Facebook. We're not sure where they're from. How can we know how much faith we have gained? Right? How can we know how much faith we have gained? That's interesting. Because let's take a look at this for a second. Faith is not something that has a metric. Like love. Love has no metric. Like there's no such thing as hey, I gave you 72% love, but you only give me 61%. We don't have a metric for it. We don't really. In the end, the only metric we have is not so much what I think in my head, but is also what I do for the person, right? When it comes to my faith, you can't really tell by inside your head. And you know why? Let me give you an example of when it comes to love, because the Bible is about love, right? What is the metric of love? Well, the metric of love, you will understand the metric of love if someone keeps saying to you, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, but they're with someone else every other day. And then they say, I'm sorry, and then they're with another girl. Then they say, no, I'm sorry, and they go with another girl. And then they say something like, how much do you think they love you? Even though they say it with their heart, no, I really love you, I'm so sorry, I just can't control myself. Well, if you really love me, you could control yourself, right? Faith is very similar too. Because the last question, it kind of ties to the last question is, faith has to do with obedience also. Because I have faith in this person, or faith, like say we have faith in God, then what about the obedience? Then obedience becomes one of the metrics we have. It's not the whole thing. Why? Because it's not just what you do, it's also what's inside your heart at the same time. And this is why it's very hard for someone else on the outside to judge. The only person who can really understand is you yourself. But part of it has to do with, I think one advice I will give you right now is, try not to think about how much you've gained, but you just have to think about is how much you're growing. And that's a way better way to look at it. Because it's really hard to say you've gained, 10 points in faith? How would you know what 10 points is? And what would it go up to? Right? The best thing you can look at when it comes to the metric of faith is, am I doing better than before? Is my faith better? Am I, say, more obedient? Do I pray more? Do I feel God more? Right? You have to look at both things that are action-oriented and things that are also like emotionally or heart-centered. And you have to check both of those things out and see if you're growing bigger or growing in your faith. Okay? So yeah, I couldn't give you a real metric, but more than the metric itself is, I believe a better metric is, are you growing in your faith or not? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Yanlan Lo from Facebook. Thank you so much for that question. That brings us to the end of today's Lockdown Tuesday. I hope you guys had a wonderful, wonderful time, and I had a wonderful time here, just staring into a camera, hoping that there's people on the other side. But we'll see you next week again at 8 p.m. here on Facebook. And for those of you who want to see this again, it'll also be on the YouTube channel Espresso with Sky. All right, everyone, see you later. Take care and have a good day or good night. Bye-bye.
To you. When I look at you, it's like I got the whole universe, the whole universe. Never thought that living could be easy. So you taught me right from wrong. Now I'm free to be full of love, full of hope. I'm empty of all things. I ain't living to make every